So today is day 2 of our meeting. And before we get started, I do want to note that we are going to post a copy of the agenda into the chat this morning, as well as a document that contains links to some of the reports that cited Washington Group tools. That list of reports was mentioned yesterday during the Washington Group updates, and some of you requested a copy. All right, next slide, please. I'd like to go through some housekeeping items before we begin. First, please remember to introduce yourselves in the chat each morning. We ask that you include your name, organization, and country. This helps us keep track of who's able to join, who participates in these meetings. And we also just love to hear from all of you. Second, please do mute your microphone when you're not speaking. And when you are speaking, we ask that you try to speak slowly, which helps the interpreters. You should also feel free to make use of that chat box. We invite and appreciate questions and discussion. And we do also, again, want to remind you the meeting is being recorded and meeting materials will be shared. With that, I would like to introduce our first session of the day. This session is entitled Disability Data Needs in Emergency Situations. Before I hand things off to the session moderator, Ulrike, I wanted to give some context for this special session. The Washington Group has served as a clearinghouse for all kinds of information on disability data. Many of the questions that we get are easily answered by pointing to our website or by referring folks to our partners. For other questions, however, we don't have as much to offer, but we do keep track of the questions that we receive. And when we get several on the same topic, we see it as a sign of a gap in the available information. And we ask ourselves, is there anything the Washington Group can do to fill that gap? How we fill the gap can take different forms. Often, our role is best as a convener, bringing people together and providing a platform for a joint activity. For example, the work to test the child functioning module teachers version would be this type of activity where we created a platform for a joint activity. The Washington Group Secretariat has gotten multiple inquiries about the collection of disability data in humanitarian situations. This has increased over the years, and we have, as the Secretariat, done some work providing technical assistance. Our partner UNICEF is also working in this area. But in determining next steps, we decided that we needed to start with the question we ask when developing any data collection tools on a topic. What will the data be used for? To get this information, we need to hear from those on the ground. We need to hear what is their need for the data. How will they be using it? This led us to ask our colleague, Ulrike Last, to develop a session to provide this important context. And we're so happy that she graciously agreed. Our sincere thanks to Ulrike and the presenters today for their participation in the meeting and for sharing their expertise with us. Based on what we hear today, we can decide on any next steps. We really hope to hear from all of the attendees today about the appropriate role for the Washington Group in this very important space. Without further ado, I'd like to turn things over to you, Ulrike. Thank you again for taking the lead on this session.
Thank you very much, Natalie, for this great introduction. And thanks a lot for the Washington Group to really invite us to provide you with the information on what disability data is needed in emergency situations. Next slide, please. My name is Ulrike Last, and I work as an Inclusive Humanitarian Action Policy and Development Lead with Humanity and Inclusion. Before I will start my little background on what the humanitarian context and crisis we are facing today are, I would like to take you through quickly who else is with me today and who I could happily mobilize for our session today. So after my quick introduction, we will have Natalie from UN OCHA, who's been working in the humanitarian sector for over 20 years, most recently in Ukraine, where she was leading the coordination, where she was the head of coordination. Since a short time, she's joined the headquarters of OCHA and is working in the needs and response analysis section as the humanitarian affairs officer within the assessment, planning, and monitoring branch. Natalie will share with us insights from the role of OCHA, which is very key in feeding the data needs for the response, coordinating that, and also how such data is contributing to the humanitarian program cycle. We also have with us, and afterwards we will hear from the ground in South Sudan. We are happy to mobilize a disability inclusion thought leader and the chairperson of the Association of the Visually Impaired in South Sudan, Maoud Anyang. He is not only a thought leader, but he's also a blind graduate from the University of Juba's Faculty of Law, and he's the first blind graduate from there. Since then, he has worked with different humanitarian and development agencies in South Sudan as an excellent trainer. He will share with us perspectives from organizations of persons with disability on the data needs in South Sudan, how are they fed, what is working well, and what gaps remain, and importantly also highlight issues around meaningful participation of organizations of persons with disabilities within that. Maoud is followed by Christelle, who is by background also a lawyer on human rights and who's been contributing to social justice. After working to address disability-based discrimination and related complaints with a legal aid office, she joined UNICEF in 2018. And since 2024, she has been deployed to the state of Palestine and Yemen as a roving disability inclusion specialist in emergencies. So she will hot from the plate, as you know. Those are two of the current places where emergencies take place. She will present her views and the work of UNICEF on ensuring children with disabilities are included in their response. Thanks, Christelle, for being with us too. Next slide, please. And that is followed, if we all stick to our time, hopefully with enough 10 to 15 minutes for you to ask questions to us.
Ulrika, this is Julie. I wanted to ask, do you want, I just received your email.
No, it's okay. Go ahead.
Okay.
I would just say next. Thank you. All good. So quickly, for all of you, just to have the picture of what we are all dealing with that work in the humanitarian sector. Right now, we have 72 countries that appealed for emergency assistance in our global system, and that translates into 312 million people in need of humanitarian assistance. And out of those, the humanitarian actors have agreed to really try and target 188 million persons that are most severely affected. Among those, we have 30 million persons with disabilities who are recognized as being as heightened risk in those emergencies, either on their life or on their health situation or their dignity and survival, due to the compounded effects of discrimination they have experienced before the crisis, and also, of course, the disproportionate higher level of barriers they're facing during the crisis. Out of those 72 countries, 42 have activated an emergency response, and that means that in those 42 contexts, humanitarian actors came together to agree on what are the key humanitarian needs and developed accordingly humanitarian needs and response plans that usually last for 1 year to guide collectively our action. And what are the current drivers? You may imagine, I'm sure most of you hear the news. Of course, on one hand, it's the man-made crisis, so conflict and violence drives those crises, and the high number right now we have the highest number of conflicts since the end of the Second World War. And of course, also the climate shocks are contributing to the natural disasters, the intensity we can find from flooding, cyclones, and droughts. And the main legal frameworks that guide our work is the international humanitarian and refugee law. And of course, most of you know it already, the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities as one of the human rights legal frameworks. Those legal frameworks are translated into operational policies and frameworks. And importantly, for us, there is the Interagency Standing Committee Guideline on Inclusion of Persons with Disabilities in Humanitarian Action, which also contains a whole chapter on data needs and collection processes in crisis around persons with disabilities. And most of what I will share also on the next slides directly relates to that. Thanks. Next slide, please. And yeah, maybe as a next slide, I had to cut a little bit. So just for all of you to be aware, we have really very clear objectives in humanitarian aid. It's not development, it's not long-term change, it's really to save lives and to alleviate suffering and to ensure the dignity of people affected. The key actors we can group in 5. So it's governments, local, national authorities, local and national non-governmental organizations and civil society organizations, including organizations of persons with disabilities who are humanitarian actors and also affected by the crisis in some contexts. We also have, of course, UN agencies with different roles, the Red Cross, Red Crescent Movement, and non-traditional actors. Next click, please. And they all contribute really to a cycle of concerted action, ideally from needs analysis to planning to resource mobilization, implementation, and reviewing. We have the sectors listed here as we are really focusing on survival and mitigating the impact. It's basic needs that we are trying to address and some specific requirements. And basic needs we understand as an example for you, those that everyone needs, so food, water, shelter, health in order to survive, and also education. And then we have some specific requirements to give you an example, for instance, assistive technology. If you lose your crutch or your wheelchair or any other assistive device, that is a specific requirement which only affects part of the population. Next, please. And we also all share different roles in the response, from resourcing, mobilization, programming, to coordination, leadership, and technical support. As an example, HI, for instance, as a disability inclusion focused actor, offers other actors our expertise on disability inclusion, but also separately on logistics. So that's called like technical support, or what we call humanitarian to humanitarian. And data collection, of course, plays a major and massive role if we want to act fast and quick to save lives and reduce suffering. Next, please. And that also I put here for you as a reminder. So for us, it's not something that we want to understand because we think it's important. Like any data we collect, we really want to have impact with and impact on programming and to contribute to that overall objective. Ideally, it's based on interagency agreed standards, and it's probably interesting for you to hear that quite a few of the UN agencies and an increasing number of NGOs, for instance, use the Washington Group set of questions as an internationally agreed standards when it comes to the population level data collection. Next, please. And for all of you, I already mentioned the barriers are also the same understanding we apply. So persons with functional difficulties or impairment interacting with barriers, that increases their risk towards survival or negative health outcomes. And if we want to have effective humanitarian assistance, we need to ensure that it eliminates barriers and supports access to basic and specific requirements. The barriers increase, so that I put that here just for you to be aware. Of course, we want to have data on both the persons with the different impairments or functional difficulties and the barriers they're experiencing. And of course, at a later stage, also on the enablers and capacities, because those, if we can identify and support those, they really contribute at the individual, family, or household level, community level to resilience. And that means that people can manage the risks better, which are in emergencies very pronounced, and they're in a better situation to be safe and also protected from violence. Next, oops. And perhaps just to sum this really up from my end, so what are really the main data needs? As you may imagine, we need data that feeds our information about the requirements and priorities needed for effective programming that also ensures accountability to the people we are trying to support in their survival. So we need to identify population with and without disabilities affected by the crisis. We also need to analyze the risks that persons with disabilities face, and the actors that contribute to those risks and the effect those risks have on persons with disabilities. For instance, to give you an example, the risk is very high that they may lose in a conflict where they have to flee some of their relatives, which may have been the support person, or they may lose their assistive technology. So that really increases their risk for survival and for safety. And we need to understand that impact this may have in order to mitigate the effect of such risk through evacuation, etc. We also need to understand the disability-related barriers and enablers that even our own humanitarian assistance can pose to persons with disabilities that influence their access to humanitarian assistance and to their capacity to be resilient. And we need to understand not only the persons with disability situation, but also after a crisis, so after an earthquake or after a conflict or a flooding, which services still exist at the local level. So what are the capacities in the area affected to deliver humanitarian assistance? And so in that sense, the data really serves 7 key purposes. We need data that identifies persons with disabilities at heightened risk to monitor their situation and also to target the assistance. We need information on number of persons with and without disabilities, their households. So very often we only have time to look at the household level to calculate the general and specific requirements. We can't wait a month between onset and delivery in order to make a decision what resources we need. It really needs to go quickly so that we can mobilize resources already after the first 3 days. And consecutively, you have to keep in mind also that the average humanitarian crisis is now 9 years. So we have the situation at the very beginning, but then we have time to collect more data and more granular data as the crisis continues, what we call protracted crisis. We also need to understand, thirdly, how the particular crisis affects persons with and without disabilities, and again, with regards to the basic needs, so nutrition, food security, income situation, health, water and sanitation, all that. And importantly, to understand the views and priorities of persons with disabilities, and to map the resources of actors contributing to the response, including organizations of persons with disabilities. We also, once the crisis continues and after the 1-year funding, normally funding is 1 year, sometimes also longer, 2 to 3 years, we need to monitor the level of access to the assistance and the services, as well as their facilities capacities to operate, and to strengthen the evidence to inform advocacy. With this, I've already reached the maximum of the time. If you go in the slides, I put some examples of typical data and good practices we found. For instance, in Bangladesh, just to highlight the graph on the bottom, we had very poor data on the prevalence of persons with disabilities in the Rohingya refugee community. So we decided different agencies together to work with REACH to have an inclusive needs assessment focusing on persons with disabilities and older persons to establish a proper prevalence. And you can see that example here. And perhaps on the next one, and key maybe to highlight, we need to be ready before the crisis comes. A lot of the crises are natural disasters. They are recurrent, so they come annually or every 2 years. So the best time to prepare data is during the preparedness. And next, click, please. And here, just to give you an example also how we can identify who's affected where. And it's a graph which indicates in a certain duration that 90% respondents had less than a week's supply for food. So we know where to go first. In comparison, on the right-hand side, you see that 60%, the level was a bit lower. So we know how to target and who to target first. And that is also from an assessment after a cyclone in Bangladesh. So that was a rapid needs assessment. And next slide. Yep. And here we also see, we differentiate. So we need to disaggregate the data also between households in order to target assistance. So on the right-hand side, you see households with extreme level of need. And we compared in Ukraine in 2023, also disaggregated by gender, disability and age, and displacement status. So you can see that households with one member with disability was having the highest level of need in comparison to other displaced households without persons with disabilities, older-headed households, or female-headed households. And that again helps to really target assistance. Thanks. With this, I would like, you can have some examples also here, how we really try to provide tools from HI side, but also from other agencies side. You find examples at the resources section and also all the references to the graphs I used if you want to have a deeper look at the data collection. With this, I welcome Natalie to share with us how the needs assessment and disability inclusion, what opportunities exist and challenges from OCHA's perspective. Over to you, Natalie.
Natalie, would you like to run your own slides? I understand that you may have made some updates. I'll be happy to unshare if you are ready to do that.
Yes, I am ready to do that. Thank you so much, Julie.
Okay. Over to you.
All right, and apologies for having to transfer the projection, right? So thank you so much, Ulrike, for the introduction and also for framing the discussion in this session today. Again, my name is Natalie. I work for a section in OCHA called Assessment, Planning and Monitoring Branch, APMB. And within that, I'm in the smaller team called Need and Response Analysis section. And today I am joined by my colleague Isabel, who is our focal point on disability inclusion for OCHA. And she will be able to provide you the guidance and share the resources that you might find useful as part of this session. Oops. All right, so a little bit of overview in terms of what I'm going to cover in my intervention. So first of all, it's introduction and background. And the second one is about humanitarian needs analysis in the what we call humanitarian program cycle that Ulrike has already mentioned in her earlier slide. And the last one, zooming in to look at disability inclusive assessment in humanitarian setting and giving a few examples and identify the challenges that we face and also a little bit of a recommendation on the way forward. So in terms of the background and introduction, just to give a quick overview of the different types of assessment that normally happen in an emergency or in a humanitarian context. So broadly, there are 3 types of assessment that we do. One we call initial assessment, and this is normally happen within the first 72 hours of the emergency. If we have a sudden onset emergency like an earthquake or a flooding, then this initial assessment normally took place very quickly and it has to be very short. So this assessment seeks to define the scale and severity of the crisis and estimate people affected and identify the location that is affected and the population that is affected, and give a quick overview in terms of the key priorities, and also look at access constraints, like whether there's any damage to the road or to any infrastructure that might affect access of people accessing services, or our access as humanitarian to the community that has been hit by natural disaster or conflict. The second type is rapid assessment. So this happened after the initial assessment, and this is to define the impact of the crisis and also estimating the people in need of humanitarian assistance and protection by the different population groups, and also estimating the severity of needs and also capturing the views of different groups of people through consultations. Again, establishing key priorities that people require assistance with. And the last one is more in-depth assessment, which this one is a larger scale, and it normally happens after the onset of the emergency. So this assessment aim to define and quantify needs, including more in-depth sectoral and operational information. And when it comes to sampling with the in-depth assessment, it has to be statistically representative data and also capturing the different views of different people that is affected by the crisis, because we know that different people, women, children, boys and girls, people with disability, elderly, they are affected by the emergency in different way. And with this in-depth assessment, we normally use it to inform the response planning and also monitoring as we go along. In terms of, just to put this, a visual of it, where to put these 3 types of assessment visually. So you have on the right-hand side, you have the type of information that we normally get for that assessment, and then at the bottom you have the time and cost that required to conduct those assessments. So as I mentioned before, initial assessment is supposed to be quick and dirty, and this is about exploratory nature. So this doesn't cost so much, and also doesn't require a lot of time to do it. Then we move to the second step, which is rapid assessment, which is more targeted and it's more explanatory. So it takes more time, it costs more, and it involves more people as well. And then the last one, which is more in-depth, and this is normally done at household level. So one example of this kind of assessment is multi-sectoral need assessment, MSNA, that normally take place as part of the humanitarian program cycle. And as I mentioned before, this one takes quite some time, and the cost is also more than the other 2 types of assessment. And in terms of sampling, there's also different, like initial assessment, it will be more community assessment. Rapid assessment is likely to be key informant interview, and in-depth assessment will be household level mainly. So multi-sectoral need assessment, MSNA, is a comprehensive survey covering crisis-affected people and in the affected area. And this is to produce a statistically generalizable data about needs, vulnerability, and the priority of conflict-affected people. So in terms of the current status, as Ulrike mentioned in her slide previously, that we have 72 countries as part of the global appeal. And within that, we have 24 countries that have humanitarian program cycle, what we call humanitarian needs overview and humanitarian response plan. So out of those 24 countries, 16 countries have MSNA, multi-sectoral need assessment, conducted by organizations like REACH or International Organization for Migration, IOM, or other national actors specializing in need assessment in different countries. And you may ask, like, why, if MSNA is supposed to be informing response planning and monitoring, why is it not happening in all of the countries? It's because, various reasons. It can be a financial reason, or it could be political reasons. And OCHA has a responsibility to lead and coordinate the work on MSNA using our convening or responsibility as intercluster coordination capacity. So within the humanitarian setting, there's a mechanism called humanitarian cluster system that is activated by the IASC, as Ulrike mentioned, to coordinate the response, and OCHA is coordinating the intercluster coordination. So this is to ensure that MSNA align with the country analytical framework and also contribute to the joint planning and the joint monitoring in the country. So now I'm going to zoom in a little bit more. Where does assessment fit into the humanitarian program cycle, the HPC? So what is the HPC to begin with? You saw this visual in Ulrike's presentation as well. So the HPC, Humanitarian Program Cycle, is a set of interlinked tools to assist the humanitarian coordinator and the humanitarian country team to improve the delivery of humanitarian assistance. So when we say to improve the delivery of humanitarian assistance, we're talking about making sure that the assistance is predictable, is effective, and also reaching those who are most in need. And it's designed to support improved preparing, prioritization, steering, and monitoring of collective humanitarian response through informed decision-making. So when we say informed decision-making, this is where need assessment and analysis come in. The HPC is done under the leadership of the humanitarian coordinator in the country, with the members of the humanitarian country teams, which usually represent the head of the organization, humanitarian organization in the country, and also done in coordination or collaboration with the cluster coordinators. As I mentioned before, in the humanitarian context, the cluster system is usually activated by the IASC. If it's in place, then we normally coordinating the HPC with the cluster coordinator. In the context where the cluster system is not activated, we're also working with the organization leading different sector, and we call it sector coordination. And it's facilitated by OCHA. And at the visual, this shows the cycle. So program cycle is a cycle. So it has 6 elements, as you can see on the visual. So overall, throughout the cycle, you have emergency preparedness that happens throughout the cycle. But annually, we do the response planning. starting from the need assessment and analysis, and this is coming from analyzing secondary data that exists in the country, updating secondary data, and if there's a gap in secondary data, we identify what needs to be, what data collection that we need to collect primarily, and conduct that primary data collection to inform the analysis. And based on that joint and intersectoral analysis, we use that to inform the strategic planning, which is part of the HRP, Humanitarian Response Plan. And once we have the humanitarian response plan based on the need analysis collectively, we use it to mobilize resources to enable the response. And then moving on to implementation and monitoring and the evaluation and review of how the response has been. And in the middle of this visual, there are two enablers of the HPC. One is the coordination and the other one is information management. And underneath, I put the resources in terms, if you would like to have more information about the implementation of the HPC. So I put the resources for the IAC reference model for the implementation of the HPC for your information. And why the HPC? As Ulrike mentioned, that in the event of the crisis, usually they're quite chaotic. And OCHA's role is to ensure that coordination takes place so that humanitarian response is as effective as possible. And in order to arrive at a consensus among different responders, including national responders, local responder, international responder, we need to answer the following question. What is the crisis that we are responding to? What are the priorities? And what are we going to do about those priorities and how? And all of these questions are answered or done through using the HPC. So for today, I'm only looking at one element of the HPC, which is need analysis, need assessment and analysis. The main step is quite simple. As I mentioned before, we need to agree on the scope of analysis and then undertake secondary data review. What data is available in a country. And if there's a data gap that we identify based on our SDR, secondary data review, we plan and collect primary data collection as appropriate. And once we have all of those data, we conduct joint intersectoral need analysis using the framework that we call Joint and Intersectoral Analysis Framework, GIAF. Again, there's a link to that as well. And apologies for lots of acronyms. So zooming in a little bit further, looking at disability inclusive assessment in humanitarian setting. I give you two examples. One is Sudan, the other one is Ukraine. This year, the MSNA was conducted in Sudan by IOM, International Organization for Migration. And the Washington Group short set of questions were integrated in the questionnaire, but it's asked at the household level and analyzed at the household level, asking whether your household have member with disability. Similarly, in Ukraine, MSNA was conducted by REACH. Washington Group short set of questions were integrated, asked at household level, and analysis done at household level. However, in case of Ukraine, there's additional targeted analysis on needs along the gender and inclusion lines. And the challenge that we face or has been identified in these two contexts is that because the Washington Group set of questions are targeted at the individual level, but the MSNA is usually happening at the household level. So sometimes it could be a little bit challenging in terms of getting an accurate estimation of people with disability coming from MSNA. I know I have 2 minutes left, sorry. And another example is the from the rapid need assessment, the global one, and you can see how disability is reflected. there's no particular question on people with disability per se, but people with disability is usually one of the options for the answer for rapid need assessment. And again, rapid need assessment normally happen with community key informant. And in terms of challenges, again, I mentioned before, the individual versus household or community level, because, sometimes it's quite difficult when we are not talking about the same unit of measurement. With Washington Group set of questions looking at individual, but MSNA or rapid need assessment or initial assessment looking at household or community level. Second challenge is time constraints, because in the emergency situation, we normally operate under very tight timelines. So sometimes it takes time to adapt and implement and certain question, and it can be time consuming. And also sampling bias, maybe not so much in terms of MSNA, but in terms of initial assessment and rapid assessment, that some population group may be easier to access than others, and that can introduce biases in analysis. Another issue is about small sample size and making it difficult to draw reliable conclusion about the entire population, including for people with disability in a humanitarian context. But at the same time, making assessment representative of different groups of population could also be costly. And the last one is about data quality. So we have to make sure that the training for enumerator is done adequately. This is my last slide in terms of the recommendation. I think humanitarian organizations have the responsibility to strive for inclusivity in assessment. And this can be done by different ways. First is to ensure that enumerators actively seek out diverse voices of the population affected by a crisis data during data collection through inclusive discussion groups or key informant of those who are knowledgeable about specific needs of the particular group. Second one is maybe we're looking at ways to better utilize the capacity of humanitarian community to ensure that we're able to communicate with people with disability. For example, having a team member in the assessment team who are fluent in sign language. But we also recognize that people with disability are not homogeneous and require different type of communication. Another thing that we can do is cross-referencing other studies or secondary data that conducted by specialized researcher or organization to enhance the analysis. Or we can collaborate with local organizations working with people with disability, with OPD, to obtain insight into their specific needs and priority. And last but not least is about data preparedness before emergency. And this is very important because when emergency happen in the country, we rely on secondary data that is available in the country. So for that, we need to make sure that the data that is available is inclusive of people with disability and different groups of population that are affected by the crisis. That's it from my side. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Natalie. And without further ado, Maud, please come on board, and great if you can look at the time when presenting. Thank you so much, Maud. Your presentation is up, Maud. Starting with first slide.
On my first of all, good time, everyone. Depending on your geographical location, this is Maud Louis from South Sudan. First of all, to start my presentation by looking at the context in South Sudan. And our context here is slightly different, of course, from many countries, because South Sudan, since its independence, has experienced conflict and different types of disasters. And from this bedrock, I would like to start the presentation looking at the different types of challenges that the data collection processes might also be facing in the context of South Sudan. First of all, we feel that the data that has been collected before the independence of South Sudan was not accurately reflecting the percentage of persons with disabilities, as it was indicating that the population of persons with disabilities was only 5.1% of the total population, which is actually much lower than the global estimate. At the same time, also, when South Sudan became independent, there was no any other type of census that was conducted. So currently, we only have one type of census that was conducted since 2008. And this means that there is no available accurate data on the population of persons with disabilities. But in 2013, when Conference decided also to join the humanitarian work, we have identified that also challenges associated to using the pre-conflict data are there because, first of all, the data before the crisis is hard to use because the high level of population movement does not actually indicate how people have been frequently moving and the directions that they have also been taking. The same time also is the nature of disasters, because South Sudan had experienced floods, armed conflict, and different types of disasters, droughts in different parts of the country. So this meant that the use of such data may not be possible, and especially that the data itself was not inclusive from the onset. Next slide. When we look at the humanitarian response plan and the humanitarian needs overview, we have noted that there has been some changes in the context of South Sudan because actually, like the last presenter was presenting that some countries have humanitarian response plan and humanitarian needs overview, and South Sudan is one of those countries. So the initial response plan for South Sudan was only referring to people with special needs. So it was not actually directly referring to persons with disabilities. However, due to some engagements with disability-focused organizations and organizations of persons with disabilities, there was change in terms of referring to persons with disabilities by referring to them as persons with disabilities. However, there was no significant change because this was not quite clear for persons with disabilities, and it was only mentioned in different parts to recognize the existence of persons with disabilities. However, when we look at the current humanitarian needs and response plan for South Sudan, most of the objectives are reflecting disability, and actually talk about disability and mention disability, which means that there has been significant change in terms of reflecting the population of persons with disabilities in the data collection processes. Next slide. When we look at data collection process in South Sudan, we see that different actors collect data in South Sudan. And these include different humanitarian actors such as UN agencies, humanitarian non-governmental organizations. We see REACH also collect data, and also OCHA through REACH also collect data. So this means that the data that is mainly collected is not most of the times disability inclusive. And this results in different actors also collecting another data so as to enable comparison with the existing data in terms of disability inclusion. At the government level, we have the National Bureau of Statistics, which cooperate with development actors most of the times and has less cooperation and interaction with humanitarian actors. And when we see that the National Bureau of Statistics was the same agency that was participating in the data collection process in 2008, where only four of the Washington Group questions were used. Next slide. When we look at the current situation in South Sudan in terms of data collection, of course, there's no doubt that data is a key component of inclusive humanitarian action and humanitarian action in all countries. And this means that the type of data collected for affected programming in the context of South Sudan should be the quantitative data that reflect the population and the size of the population that is being targeted, in humanitarian response, and which is, of course, inclusive of the population of persons with disabilities and also the qualitative data. And when we look at the qualitative data, of course, it has to take into consideration the specific needs of persons with disabilities, which should be part and parcel of the humanitarian response program, because most of the times we see that the focus is on mainstreaming. However, the specific needs are not taken into consideration, and this means that qualitative data collection process will be able to address this kind of problem. When we look at the data collection process, of course, it has different types of methods, and in order to ensure that persons with disabilities are involved in the data collection processes. But what is key is by looking at the 4 must-do actions under the ISC guidelines on inclusion of persons with disabilities in humanitarian action. Next slide. What we believe that what we believe is an important action to be done in order for us to remedy this kind of situation is the need for integrating disability inclusion in all types of data collection processes. Currently, of course, there is some level of hesitance from some of the actors to use the Washington group set of questions with the belief that it may actually increase the size of the questionnaire that they are using for data collection. And at the same time also, as one of the presenters also mentioned, in terms of collecting data at the household level, this is actually most of the times also difficult in terms of applying the Washington group set of questions according to some of the actors. And also some of the concerns that we got from some of the actors were that understanding some of the intention behind some of the Washington group set of questions was not clear to some of the actors. However, through our engagement with Humanity and Inclusion and other disability-focused organizations, we were able to reduce and minimize such kind of incidences, because most of the time they are a result of inability to understand issues to do with disability. And this actually has increased the use of the Washington group short set of questions in data collection, and at the same time also integrating data on barriers and facilitators for disability inclusion in different types of data collection processes. And what is critical in this is to involve organizations of persons with disabilities in prioritization of findings and data collection processes from the onset until the end. And this means that throughout the design stages, that the monitoring and evaluation phase. Next slide. Here, we just highlight some of the areas where some of the data were collected jointly by Humanity and Inclusion and or international organizations for migration. However, what is important to mention here is that there has been some data that has been collected by World Food Program on social safety and social safety net, which indicated some population of persons with disabilities of up to 16% in some of the locations in Bahr Ghazal area in South Sudan. And also when we look at the data collected in WOW by International Organization for Migration and Humanity and Inclusion and other organizations of persons with disabilities, it was actually ranging between it was actually about 14.4%, with about 18% of the households reporting having a person with disability as a member of the household. Up to here, I would like to say thank you so much.
Thank you, Maud. And with this, Crystal, the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you so much, Ulrike. I'm not sure if maybe you can mute participants who are not muted, because I cannot do that from my side. Thank you so much. I hope you can confirm that you hear my audio well. Sorry, my
Yes, thank you.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. My Wi-Fi is a bit patchy, so you will not be able to see me, but you will be able to hear me. I will present to you UNICEF's role in data collection, as well as some of the needs for disaggregated data, as well as evidence on the situation of children with disabilities that we see is necessary for us to be able to provide humanitarian assistance. And also I'll present to you some of the promising practices and challenges and recommendations. But since we are very pressed on time, I will try to speed up a bit and skip some of the more theoretical things and things that have been already said and focus more on the examples that I will provide. And I think I will focus mostly on the work that we have done when I was with the State of Palestine office this year. So we can move to the first slide there. Thank you so much. So just quickly to refer to UNICEF's frameworks, the strategic plan, as well as the disability inclusion policy and strategy, and our core commitments for children in humanitarian action. All these make up UNICEF's policy frameworks and our commitment to reach children with disabilities in our humanitarian assistance. So as Ulrike was mentioning, we are not able to reach children with disabilities if we do not gather data and evidence on their situation, and if we do not use it to inform our priorities, as well as the concrete interventions that we have in our programming. So, for example, in Palestine, we used the estimate of children with disabilities that we have gathered through supporting the government to hold a multiple indicator cluster survey. So we were able to have the most accurate estimate of children with disabilities, which is for Palestine 12%. This is of course pre-conflict, and 12% is, as you know, higher than the global estimate of 10%. So this aided us in planning our response to know that 12% of the child population has a disability. In Palestine, we also worked with the government to gather data on the situation of children with disabilities through mapping services and understanding what the barriers are for access for children with disabilities and their families to these services. So we were able to know where the gaps are. And again, reiterating that this is pre-conflict, of course. Then I want to mention also the issue of lack of a disability information management system. So in Palestine, there is something called the General Union for Persons with Disabilities. It's a government body, and they do disability assessment. So they collect data on, accurate data on persons with disabilities, their location and the type of disability, severity, and needs. And they're able to use this data to target people for provision of services. But the system is not digitalized. I mean, it's not really a system. There's no software where this data is inputted. And when we spoke with the branch offices of the General Union in Gaza, for example, their offices were destroyed, the laptops were destroyed where they had this data. So this also included data that they were gathering after the escalation of 7th of October. So we were not able to have more accurate data on the numbers of children with disabilities in Gaza. So what we had from the registry was around 6,000 of children with disabilities. While we're looking at the mixed estimates, the number should have been over 100,000. So this really created a challenge for us to be able to target children with disabilities and their families with services like, for example, cash assistance. We need to be able to know how many they are and where they are in location, and to be able to have some form of contact information to reach them. Then lastly, to mention, in terms of the humanitarian program cycle, of course, we also need data to be able to have a correct overview of the needs and to monitor whether we are reaching persons with disabilities or not. So actually in Palestine, we worked together with Humanitarian Inclusion to train partners, for example, the health cluster, for them to be able to work with their cluster partners to collect data on whether the partners were reaching persons with disabilities or not. We can move to the next slide. Yes, thank you. So in an emergency context like Gaza, what kind of data does UNICEF and other humanitarian actors need to be able to reach children with disabilities? I just want to reiterate the point here that I think also Ulrike shared the decision-making tool, which some of the humanitarian actors here were a part of developing. So this tool was really helpful in the Gaza response context for us to be able to understand what kind of data to collect, what kind of data do we need. So the key message here really is to first and foremost understand what are we going to use the data for. So we're not prioritizing or using a capacity to identify, collect any data that we're actually not going to use. So I'll give you one example of what we did in terms of our targeting of cash assistance for families with children with disabilities. We integrated the Washington Group questions in a tool, a data collection tool that we used to identify households eligible for cash transfers. And then we contacted our partners, organizations of persons with disabilities, the cluster system, and they shared this data collection template with many actors, and they were able to share back with us data that we could then use to be able to have a larger number of households with children with disabilities whom we could target with cash assistance. If that's, remember I mentioned from the previous registry that we had, there were only a couple of thousand who were identified there as households with children with disabilities. But through doing this work with the clusters, the partners, the organizations of persons with disabilities, we were able to collect around 1,000 new recipients of cash assistance. I can also mention here the use of accurate estimates, for example, of disability prevalence. So we use this in the response plan for the Gaza response. And then we also had an understanding of how the conflict was impacting children with disabilities through different forms of evidence that our partners were able to gather also after the escalation, partners in Gaza. For example, we knew that most people with disabilities had lost their assistive devices. So we knew that this had to be a priority for UNICEF. We had to procure assistive devices to provide these because most people had lost them or had never had access to assistive devices. And then in terms of reach, we need accurate data on, as I mentioned, on location, number of persons with disabilities and what their needs are for us to be able to target with specific assistance. Like, for example, assistive devices, as I mentioned, this is not something that we can just procure en masse and then distribute. This requires individual fitting. We need individual data to be able to do this work. I think we can skip now to the next slide. I'm trying to be quicker. Okay, on this slide, I will only mention UNICEF's work through the Disability Advisory Group, where I believe also Humanitarian Inclusion participates. We have been working together to really increase disability inclusion, to mainstream it in humanitarian needs overviews and humanitarian response plans. For example, in Yemen, I was there a couple of months ago. There is a Disability Inclusion Working Group, which Humanitarian Inclusion and UNHCR co-leads. They were able to ensure that disability inclusion is well reflected in the humanitarian response plan. But of course, the challenge is then to translate it into action. we can move to the next slide on challenges, and then I'll mention some of the challenges and round up with the recommendations. Thank you, Ulrika. I'm not sure if I was able to follow your instruction of being faster. All right, so for the challenges, I think maybe this will be a bit of a repetition, and then speaking to the choir, we are all aware of the challenges. We know that there is a lack of data, limited data on the number of persons with disabilities, and more administrative data on the location, their needs, as well as evidence on what the barriers are. And especially in an emergency context, like in Gaza, for example, really almost no evidence on number of new disabilities created through injuries and other causes related to the conflict, like, for example, disease outbreaks. There is it is difficult, as most of you know, to collect data in an emergency situation, especially for Gaza. There are access constraints, security is a challenge. For the Union of Persons with Disabilities, who I mentioned, who wanted to continue their work to identify persons with disabilities and also collect data on new disabilities due to different injuries. They were not able to do it because roads are destroyed. I mean, there's nothing left of infrastructure, basically. And of course, the imminent threat of attacks. Then I will also mention the need to translate the Washington Group questions. I know they have been translated into many languages, but it's still a need to translate into other languages. For example, in Ethiopia, UNICEF was working to translate the question sets into local languages. I will make here also a point on use of data. We need to collect data that we will use. As I mentioned, our capacity is limited. And we have some examples from some countries where there has been intensive efforts to collect data, to conduct focus group discussions, interviews, and so on, where the data has actually not been used. So as our accountability to the population and to provide humanitarian assistance, we really need to be mindful of this, and to never to collect data if we're not going to use the data. And there are many partners in Palestine who are raising the concern that if we are collecting data, we also need to be able to provide some form of service. This collecting data raises expectations. If we're not able to provide, to refer to any service, if there's nothing available, as in the context of Gaza, there really is very, very, very limited available services, then it's an ethical dilemma whether we should collect that data or not if we're not able to provide any form of service. Thank you very much.
With this, we are very conscious that we run over time. Natalie, back to you. And we offered to also take questions in the chat and answer if that's possible, and that's a viable option to make up for us wanting to share a lot with you. Thanks for the opportunity. Back to you.
Thank you so much. I want to give a huge thank you to Ulrike, Natalie, Maud, and Crystal for a very informative session. And as they suggested, please go ahead and place any questions that you have for them in the chat so that they can follow up with you. Also note that many resources and links to reports related to emergency situations have been placed in the chat already. But at this point, let's move to a 10-minute break. So we will come back here in about 10 minutes. At exactly in 10 minutes. And we'll be hearing about 2 new disability data collection tools developed in collaboration between the Washington Group and UNICEF. Thanks so much, everyone.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back. It's good to see you again here today on day 2. I want to mention again that we have a number of resources in the chat for you to consider, to access and download, as well as if there are any follow-up questions from the previous session, we will collect those. And if we don't answer them here now and today, then we will do so in the future. I also wanted to mention that, as usual, in the last session tomorrow, we will probably talk about next steps, and we will also talk about ideas for webinars to hold in the upcoming meeting. And with that, I would suggest that perhaps we consider whether we want to hold a webinar on the topic of emergency situations and perhaps spend a little bit more time and take a deeper dive into that topic. So please consider whether that is something that you would be interested in. And when we have that poll tomorrow on topics for future webinars, please consider whether you want to suggest that or not, if that's of interest to you. Let's kick off our 5th session of this annual meeting. I'm very pleased to have Claudia Kappa here today with us to talk about 2 Washington Group UNICEF collaborations that resulted in launches of questionnaires this year that have been very much in the making for quite so many years. It was a fantastic launch in June in association with COSP. I hope Claudia can tell you more about that, because she and her team, with the support of the Australian government, really provided to all attendees quite an experience. And it was quite a celebration of these 2 new tools. So Claudia, I will turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Julie, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. Before I start, I would like to mention that I'm unable to share the screen because somebody else is sharing. So as soon as I have an opportunity, I will pull up the slides. And indeed, it's a pleasure for me to speak on behalf of UNICEF and the Washington Group on Disability Statistics to present the latest tools that we launched in June 2024.
So Claudia, I'm sorry to interrupt. So would you prefer to run your own slides?
Sure.
I'll stop sharing if that's the case.
Thanks.
Over to you.
Thank you. So let me start by using some data to illustrate the current situation when it comes to children with disabilities in education. As you have heard in this meeting, the child functioning module was launched in 2016, and since then it's been used to collect data on a number of countries. As of today, we have nationally available surveys that collected information using the CFM in over 60 countries in the world. These data were collected as part of mostly multiple indicator cluster survey, where a number of indicators related to education are also monitored. Mothers, primary caregivers, children sometimes themselves from age 15 and above are asked a number of questions about their educational status, in particular whether or not they're attending school, the type of school they attend, the level they are in, etc. When combined with information from the child functioning module, these education-related indicators provide a picture of the proportion of children who are, for instance, out of school. And this is what this graph shows. This graph is a weighted average for the countries with available data with respect to the proportion of children who are out of primary school out of lower secondary school and out of upper secondary school, disaggregated by disability status. So we have data for children without functional difficulties, displayed in gray. We have data for children with one or more functional difficulty, displayed in light blue. And in darker blue, we have children who have more than one functional difficulties, so multiple functional difficulties. And the bars, the height of the bars, correspond to the proportion of these children in these three different categories were out of school at these three different levels. And as we can clearly see, these bars are gradually higher, so indicating that the level of out of school children is bigger for children with functional difficulties compared to children without functional difficulties. And even within the population of children with functional difficulties, the proportion of children who are out of school is highest for children who have multiple functional difficulties. And the proportion of out of school also increases with levels, okay? So primary level versus upper secondary level, we can see that the proportion of children who are out of school increases, particularly for children with functional difficulties and with multiple functional difficulties. So this graph clearly illustrates that many children with functional difficulties are out of school. So to respond to the need for additional information on the experience of children with disability in school settings, UNICEF and the Washington Group, in collaboration with many other partners, including some of them are actually here on this webinar as well, tested a version of the child functioning module that can be used with teachers in school setting to reflect on the population of students with functional difficulties. So before I explain the teacher version of the child functioning module, I want to take a moment to go back to the original child functioning module that was developed and launched by UNICEF and the Washington Group in 2016. The original child functioning module was developed to identify children with functional difficulties through household surveys, using mothers or primary caregivers as respondent. The questions ask about functional difficulties across several domains of functionings, and disability is conceptualized as a continuum with response option to the questions on functionings that range from no difficulty in functioning to some difficulty, a lot of difficulty, or cannot do at all. For the purpose of calculating the proportion of children with functional difficulties, we use the top two response category and include in the estimate the proportion of children who reportedly have functional difficulty in any of the domain with a severity that is a lot of difficulty or cannot do at all. Now, the CFM builds on the International Classification of Functioning and cover what in the International Classification of Functioning is described as activity limitations or difficulty in functioning. So this is what the Washington Group UNICEF module on child function captured, and the original one captured this difficulty in the context of a household survey with mothers as respondent. Now, we've been approached over the years by others who wanted to use the child functioning module in other types of data collection, using teachers as respondent in lieu of mothers. And that's what triggered the development of the teacher version of the child functioning module. But before being able to use the child functioning module with teachers, we had to do methodological work. Why? Because the original child functioning was designed to be used with mothers or primary caregivers who interact with children, in most cases on a daily basis. And therefore, we needed to check whether teachers who might interact with a larger number of children compared to mothers, and not in the same way, or with the same frequency might provide valid and reliable responded when asked about their students. And this led to the development of the teacher version of the child functioning module, which was developed to identify students, in this case with functional difficulty, taking advantage of teachers as respondents and data collection settings where children are found, which are obviously schools. The questions are very similar to the original child functioning, but of course we had to make the necessary modifications because, for instance, teachers might not observe certain activities that children perform. And I'll come back with an example later on. And ultimately, we wanted to leverage the opportunity of relying on teachers because obviously these can potentially expand the use of the child functioning module in other type of data collection, including, for example, in the context of education management information systems. Now, let's look at the domains that are covered in the teacher version of the child functioning module. As you can see, the domains are very similar. Obviously, we are targeting here children age 5 and above, because they tend to be in schools at a higher proportion than early childhood education. But also in consideration of the fact that obviously for younger children, even relying on mothers might come with certain difficulties because certain functional difficulties develop with age or manifest with age. So the domain of functioning covered by the teacher version of the child functioning module are very similar, in some cases identical to the original CFM. Just as an example, we had to drop the questions related to difficulty with self-care when it comes to the teacher version of the child functioning module, because teachers might not observe the child's ability to feed himself or herself or dress. It's not something that teachers might observe in their interaction with their students. Now, what type of possible uses the teacher version of the child functioning module has? Well, very similar to the original child functioning module, in that it can produce population level estimates of the prevalence of students with functional difficulties. Obviously, we are interviewing teachers, and teachers can report about their students. When we interview mothers, mothers report about their children, regardless of their educational status, right? So asking mothers give you the advantage of also getting information about the functional difficulties of non-student children. So that's a limitation on the teacher version. But we can also use the teacher version of the child functioning module to disaggregate educational outcomes by disability status. So, for instance, in the context of EMIS or other school-based type of data collection, a number of education-related indicators might be collected, and the teacher version of the child functioning module incorporated in the same data collection efforts allow for the disaggregation of these education-relevant indicators by disability status of the students. But also, the testing that was done indicated that with certain caveats and limitations, the teacher version of the child functioning module can also be used to screen the student population and identifying those students who will benefit for further evaluation. Instead of doing this further evaluation on the overall population of students, the child functioning module teacher version can be used to screen out the population of those without functional difficulties. Obviously, with any screening tool, there is always a level of children that can be missed by the screening tools. So the child functioning module teacher version is not exempt from this limitation, but it proved to capture a significant proportion of children who need further follow-up. We just wanted to show some of the results from the validation that was done of the teacher version of the child functioning module. One component of this validation had to do with comparing the responses given by teachers to the responses given by mothers or primary caregivers for the same child. In other words, we wanted to compare and see if mothers and teachers give the same answers vis-a-vis the same child. And these are the results from the testing that was conducted in Kosovo, regulated under the United Nations Security Council Resolution 1244. Here you have in this graph the proportion of students for which the teachers and the mothers reported that a lot of difficulty or cannot do at all responses across the different domains of functioning. And as you can see, across all domains, the level of agreement, meaning the proportion of children for which the mothers and the teacher gave the same answers, is above 90%. So in other words, you can interview the mother or primary caregiver, you can interview the teacher, you're going to get the same answers for above 90% of the teachers, of the students. We did a similar exercise in Malawi. And as you can see here, also very high level of agreement, above 80% or close to 90% at the domain level. And in the case of the overall, will be a little bit over 70%. Obviously, we look at different factors that might affect the ability of the teacher to report on children. We look at the type of interaction that the teacher has, the classroom size, the sex of the teacher, and we are about to publish an article that give more details about what we found out. But overall, as we expected, we realized that the length of the teacher's exposure to the child was a significant factor, but other factors did not prove to be particularly relevant. I just want to take a moment to acknowledge the partners who really contributed to this methodological work by initiating or leading or contributing to this pilot that were done. Because besides the case of Malawi and Kosovo, other countries saw this testing, including in humanitarian settings, and wanted to acknowledge the partners displayed here who contributed to this methodological work. In the second part of my presentation, I wanted to talk about the inclusive education module, which has been, again, developed by UNICEF and the Washington Group. We have worked on this module for more than 10 years. So it was a significant investment of time and resources, and it was particularly complex because, of course, when we think about data collection on environmental factors, so on inclusive education, so looking at children and access of children with and without disability to education, the complexity is significant because, of course, context varies by definition. So at the end of this 10 plus years of methodological work, we were finally able to release a module. Is actually a set of questions. There are sub-modules. And the basic purpose of this set of questions is as follows. First of all, this set of questions are meant to be addressed to mothers, again, or primary caregivers of school-age children. So the ages varies by the country. It goes from 5 to 6 years of age to 17 years of age, depending on the countries. These type of questions can be added to multi-topic surveys or dedicated surveys on education. And they're really meant to be used to understand the barriers that children with disabilities may experience. Obviously, when used in conjunction, again, with the child functioning module, all the information collected through the inclusive education module can be disaggregated for children with and without functional difficulties. So going back quickly to the International Classification of Functioning, as I mentioned earlier, the child functioning module captures the activity limitations. In the case of the inclusive education module, we wanted to gather information related to participation restriction or barriers to participation. So within the context of the ICF framing, you can see that the module on inclusive education really tried to cover this other component of the ICF framework. As I mentioned earlier, the inclusive education module is actually a set of modules. It's a set of questions. There are 5 main modules. The first module is the child background module, and I'm going to give in a little bit some more information about the content of this module. Then we have a module on school type, a module on school environment, a module on reasons for not attending school, and a module on school attendance determinant. So in this visual representation, we wanted to illustrate the fact that through these 5 different modules, we are actually trying to gather information about the educational profile of the child population. Now, some of the children might be attending school, while others might not attend school. In the category of children attending school, you might have 2 main subgroups: those who are going to a physical school and those who are exclusively homeschooled. Among those who are going to a school, you might have children who attend regularly and are expected to complete their school year. But you might also have children who do not attend regularly. They miss a significant number of schools or school days, okay? So for this category of children attending school, there are this subgroup of children, and we develop a set of questions that really help us understand the school environment, but also the reason why certain children are unable to attend school regularly. We also wanted to understand the experiences of children who are exclusively homeschooled, because the fact that they are homeschooled, for example, might be due to the fact that the schools that are available in the area where the child lives are not able to provide the child with the learning experience that he or she needs. So we really wanted to understand the reasons and the characteristics of these experiences that children live. Then when it comes to children not attending school, our main motivation was to be able to understand the reasons why these children are not attending school. Some of them have never attended. Others attended at some point but dropped out. So we develop a set of questions that are really useful for understanding these determinants that might be behind the fact that the children are not in schools. Okay, so the modules have a number of skip patterns that allow you to administer the questions that are informative with respect to the educational situation of the various child population. Now, in what follows, and here I'm going to be soon concluding, I wanted to give a little bit more detail about the content of this module. Under the child background, we gather some basic information for all children, and this information allows us to start building this profile of students or children who are not in school. So we ask questions whether the child has ever attended school, the highest level that was attended and completed, and whether the child is currently attending. So some basic information. In the module about school type, we go a little bit deeper into understanding for children who are attending school, the type of school that the child is attending, whether the child is homeschooled, the type of classroom that the child is attending, how many days the child has missed of school, and the parental expectations about completing the school year. For children who are attending school regularly, we ask a number of questions about the school environment, whether the child needs help to get to school, whether the child receives support from school staff, the child use of learning material, as well as the child use of wash and recreational facility. We ask questions about the conditions of the classroom, about safety and acceptance by peers, and questions about the responsiveness of school to concerns about the child education that might be expressed by mothers or primary caregivers, and the school and the teacher's ability to meet the students' learning needs. If the child is not attending school, mothers are asked about a number of reasons that might explain why the child is not attending. Questions are asked about whether the child was denied enrollment. Questions are asked about the conditions at the school that might represent the barriers to the child participation, whether lack of adequate transportation is one of the reasons. Reasons might be due to safety, accessibility concern, lack of assistive devices and supports, and teachers' inability to meet students' learning needs or unfair treatment by teachers. And again, we know that these type of decisions sometimes are complex. There might be multiple reasons. So we build the questionnaire in a way that allow for multiple reasons to be mentioned by parents, particularly specifically mothers or primary caregivers. And finally, for children who are out of school, but also for children who are unable to attend regularly, we ask questions about school attendance determinant, because we know that in some cases, children might not attend or attend regularly because of financial constraints or other obligations that the child might have, for instance, needing to work, take care of other family members, or because the child has given birth already or is parenting another child, might have a health condition, might be considered too young or too old, might be considered as having completed enough schooling, or there could be low expectations about future earning on behalf of parents, which determine the fact that the child is not able to prioritize schooling. To conclude, I just wanted to share the pages where the inclusive education module, the teacher version of the child functioning module, and the child functioning module itself can be found. So this is the screenshot of the pages. On data.unicef.org. You will find information about this instrument, but also supporting material, such as the module translated in different languages, syntaxes for data analysis, tabulation plans, training material, guidelines, so on and so forth. Obviously, we will continue to build these pages as we develop these instruments and this material that can support the uptake of the instrument. And of course, the same content is available on the Washington Group website. Thank you so much for listening to my presentation. And of course, I will be very happy to answer any call. Before concluding, I just wanted to restate our appreciation for the collaborations we had with the many partners that contributed to this work, including the partners that were listed on the slide. But first and foremost, I wanted to extend my gratitude to the colleagues from the Washington Group on Disability Statistics. This has been for UNICEF one of the most fruitful collaboration ever, and we feel honored to be able to continue this collaboration with the Washington Group colleagues. Thank you so much, and over to you for questions.
Thank you, Claudia. I'm noticing in the chat there is a comment and a question from Paavi from Finland that indicates that they collect survey data directly from lower and upper secondary school students, and for that they would need a self-report tool for functional difficulties where the children answer for themselves. So she's asking, are there any other countries which are in need for a self-report tool for youth, or even have used one? That's probably a question out to the entire audience, but also I thought I would give you an opportunity, Claudia, to answer in case you are aware of, practical cases where the tools have been used in a self-administer context.
Thank you, Julian. Thank you for this question. There is the Health School-Based Children Survey. The acronym is tough, and probably that's the one you are also referring to in the questions from Finland. The questions were actually administered as part of this study that is conducted in multiple countries, mostly European, but there are a few countries outside of Europe where actually the questionnaire were administered to students directly. So they were self-administered surveys. There is no reason in principle why the CFM cannot be used with in a self-administered manner. Obviously, there are some changes that need to be introduced, but the experience from the surveys, the studies that were conducted not by us, it's an independent study, indicate that the module can be administered. It's challenging when we try to combine reporting by mothers for a certain subgroup of children with reporting of children themselves. Obviously, we have to be careful when combining this reporting. But I also remember that methodological work was done at some point through the development of the CFM in the US by the National Center for Health Statistics that compared the responses given by children with the responses given by parents for the same child. And indeed, overall, there was a very high level of agreement across most domains. Obviously, some domains like those related to psychosocial difficulty, making friends, the level of agreement between parents and children were a little bit lower, but it was lower for mostly at the level of, for instance, the parents or the child saying no difficulty, and the parents or the child saying some difficulty, not for cases where the difficulty was a lot or cannot do at all.
Exactly. Yes. Yes. We have that cognitive testing report. If anyone is interested in seeing that, let us know. To Pavi's question, Claire responded that they are using a modified version of the child functioning module in their household survey, which is designed for self response at the age of 15 and up. And I will also share that from the United States, we have a national data collection where the administration rules for that survey are that it is self-response from age 15 and up. And so those questions are answered by 15, 16, and 17-year-olds as well in the US. There's another question. This is from Rita. Could you explain how the first module is applied? This would be the teacher version of the child functioning module. Is it done at the household level first and then with the teacher?
Thank you, Fiorella, for this question. No, there is no need to do first a household survey and then the teacher. We tested, obviously, the module first to evaluate, if we were to interview mothers versus teachers, are we going to get the same answer? This was part of the methodological work. But after completing the methodological work, we are reassured that interviewing teachers is almost equivalent, if I can say so, with a lot of caveats, to interviewing mothers, meaning the responses, there is agreement in the assessment of the child. So we can go straight into asking teachers about their students. And that's the advantage of having done this methodological work. We can leverage now student-based and school-based surveys or interviews with teachers to provide information about children. So we don't need to do a household survey. We can go straight to teachers, and teachers are going to be able to report on their students.
Are there any other questions, or would anyone like to come in and ask a question directly? Let's scroll the pages. There are a number of people with us today who have been involved over the years in the tools to develop or the development of the tools to collect data on or for children. And so I do want to acknowledge you. I'm not going to call you out by name. I see one of you has come on camera, but Elena and Mitch and many others who have been involved in these efforts, we thank you very much. Mitch, do you want to come in?
Yeah, hi, everybody. It's really good to see you all. Just a question about the parent version or the mother version and the teacher version. They're very similar, but they're not identical. And it actually, I'm pleased to see the results that you showed, Claudia, but I'm a little surprised that they are as similar as you showed. And I'm sure that there's valid testing that was carried out. The environments are so different, and the relationship between a mother and a single child or her own children and a teacher who may have 25, 35, 45 children in a classroom just creates an environment that I, for one, actually wouldn't expect the results to be as good as they are. And I'm just going to follow that up with I've been sort of consulting a little bit, not very much, on a project here that's run here in Norway through FAFO and SINTEF, looking at mothers and teachers or households and teachers in Ghana and Niger. And they've done multiple assessments of the same child over time. So they have these cohorts of children, and unfortunately, their results aren't as similar. I think there are a lot of valid reasons for them not to be, but I'd just like to hear your take on that.
Thank you, Mitch, and it's so good to see you. Indeed, we were surprised as well. And that's why at the beginning, we were a bit resistant to say, oh, wait, no, don't use the child functioning module with teachers. We don't know, we assume it's not going to be the same. We did a lot of methodological work, not just to compare teachers versus parents, but also two teachers that know the same child. We also tested the self-administration of teachers as a questionnaire versus the interview with the teachers. We tested with training and without training. And we realized that indeed there are differences between teachers and parents. But these differences tend to be on the mild category. So shouldn't call it mild, but some difficulty, okay? When we consider the some difficulty, there you have a lot of differences. They tend to be, in most cases, when with parents, for some domains, parents reported some difficulty and the teachers say no difficulty, like communication, for example. You know, teachers say, no, the child can communicate, maybe doesn't want to talk to you, but he can communicate. But teachers were also picking up some difficulty more in the learning domain than parents, because of course they are more attuned and they're more careful and more, granular in reviewing the functional difficulty when it comes to learning. So when we consider that some, we noticed that there were a much higher level of discrepancies. And that's also the reason why, as you may remember, for mothers and for the regular child functioning, we don't include the some category, because we were picking up a lot of noise or, cases that might not be. So similarly, when we compare two teachers, and we did so in the case of Kosovo, for example, there is full agreement, complete agreement. In some cases where first level, like the main teacher versus specialized subject matter experts that come less frequently, this can be due to the fact that teachers might talk to each other, obviously in certain contexts. We were equally concerned about the size of the school, and that's why we tested in Kosovo, where we have an average size of 22 children, as well as in Malawi, where at first we thought there were data entry errors because we had classroom with like 80 students. We said, no, that's not possible. No, it's possible. And of course, we realized that the primary teachers, as opposed to the school principal, in some cases, there are also a person who is appointed to be the administrative focal point, let's say, for certain classroom, that person compared to the primary teacher, they were in large disagreement with the primary teacher being closer to the mother and the primary caregiver, for example. So all of these factors we did take into consideration, and it was indeed surprising to us as well. One of the recommendations and the thing that we struggled the most was to say, what do we do with the SAM category? Who is right? Who is wrong? We cannot approach it this way, right? We cannot say who is right, who is wrong. So we decided that because of the level of disagreement, we don't want to put them in the same calculation, but definitely those who apply this type of instrument for the SAM category, they might want to create an opportunity for some sort of follow-up. Let me put it this way. So we have to be very careful what with labeling, but definitely for some form of follow-up might be useful.
I think it's interesting too that, mothers. So let me start by saying some of the questions where we thought we would see the most difference are in the more behavioral questions, the ability to, control behavior or adjust to changes, or some of the mental health questions. And the contexts are very different. What happens at home versus what happens in the school setting are very different, but there's just so much agreement in that those more extreme categories of a lot of difficulty that it kind of gives us a bit of confidence. And that high level of agreement between the teachers themselves, given that the context is now held constant, I think that we felt fairly justified in some of the decisions there. The other thing, we did add, Claudia, help me here, but we did add the phrase compared to other children, right? And in many of the, if not all of the questions in the teacher version to help, smooth out this idea that, we're not asking, for an individual assessment that might equate to something more clinical or validly reliable in that way, but that in general, compared to a child's peers, what is their functional level in any particular domain. So
one thing I might add also is the fact that another discovery or positive outcome from this testing is that we realized that when teachers have an opportunity to receive training on the module, but also when teachers implement the module several times, they start looking at their children, at their students in a broader way. So I still remember some of the notes from the field indicating that some teachers were surprised to be asked questions about children's ability to make friends or difficulty making friends. They said, we never pay attention to this thing. Why does it matter? Well, no, it does matter. It can be obviously indicative of so many different issues, underlying issues. So I think the training allowed teachers to look at the students differently, improve the quality of the reporting, but also help facilitate some conversation and some reflection of how this data collection can be useful for teachers, because they look at their children differently and because they gain a broader perspective on the things that matter. So training is definitely something we would recommend. Obviously, if this is integrated in routine data collection, when this type of data collection happens at regular intervals, by default, teacher will get better at using this instrument as the data collection continues.
There are best practices for implementing these tools, as Claudia said, and some of the reports do report out a lot of the positive nature of implementation of this tool in school settings. Teachers really embraced the training, a deeper understanding of disability, as well as Claudia says, this more nuanced understanding of their students themselves. And so just as a practical matter, you know, one of the best practices, one of the recommendations is not to conduct this assessment within the first 2 or 3 weeks of the start of a school year, for example. I mean, this may seem very obvious, but you want to conduct this activity after the teacher has had some time to acclimate to their students. But that doesn't mean that the training itself can't happen before the school year starts or soon thereafter, because it allows that time for teachers to observe their students in that way. I don't see any other questions relative to this particular session's topic, but I do want to take one question before we go to session 6. And I think we're a little bit over, but that's okay. Someone asked in the chat, I think it was Hussein, in my opinion, there should be the opportunity to essentially allow other questions on disabilities with the Washington Group short form questions, recognizing that disabilities in each country. And I do want to mention that, you know, we have often said that the short set or any of these tools are a starting point. If there are questions that a country feels they want to add to collect data on anything of interest and importance in that country, then by all means add that. So, you know, one of our more common examples is one on albinism. In some countries, albinism is a very important data point to collect. And so we encourage those countries to add those questions after the Washington Group tool in that data collection. But that kind of, you know, editing of the content of a collection to meet your country's needs is absolutely embraced. And we've always kind of held that position, that we understand that other data are important for collection. I think there was another comment about having a face-to-face meeting, and I would concur with that. So if resources are available and there is a host country willing, we can consider that. Okay, Claudia, thank you again so much for coming and talking about this, and here's to many more years of good collaboration. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Let's see. We are going to now turn to our next session, which is session 6. And this is where we go into our regional group breakout session. And I will turn it over to Natalie to help walk us through that. Natalie.
Great. Thanks so much, Julie. All right. So as Julie said, the last session of today is going to be our regional group breakout sessions. As in previous years, these breakout sessions are designed to facilitate discussions and collaborations among members of regional groups and their colleagues in the region. Note that we will be asking each regional group to report back to the full Washington Group membership tomorrow on day 3 of our annual meeting. So just keep that in mind as you have your discussions. Next slide, please. So this year, we're going to have 7 breakout rooms available. The first 5 rooms are for established regional groups, but we've also added a breakout room for Washington Group members from European countries, as well as a breakout room for non-affiliated countries and organizational partners. And you should feel free to join whichever of the rooms you feel is most appropriate. Note that even if you're not an active member of a certain region, if you're located in that region, you should feel free to join that group. In terms of how to join a breakout room, you're going to be, oh, sorry, I just gonna, great, okay, sorry. In order to join a breakout room, I'll just take you through the steps. Don't look to join them yet. They're not yet available. But the way it's going to work is you're going to see an option at the bottom of the screen to join a breakout room. There's going to be an icon essentially for breakout rooms. And you'll see a list of the rooms, and you can just click a button that says join this room. I should also mention that you will have the option to switch breakout rooms. So if you go into one breakout room and then you realize, oh, wait, actually, I meant to join a different room, or I'm curious what they're discussing in this other room that's relevant to my area. You can do that as well. What you will need to do in that case is once in a breakout room, you would look at the bottom right and you would see an option to switch rooms. And again, you would just pick the room that you want to join. You'll also note when you're in a breakout room that there will be a large button in the bottom right corner of your screen. I think it's normally red, that says leave room. If you click that button, it will bring you back to the main room where we are now. You won't exit out of the meeting. You'll be taken back here. And that's another place where you can come and pick to switch into a different room. Now, I do want to mention that once you're all in your breakout rooms, we do ask that the first item of business be the assignment of a rapporteur. This person is going to report back to the Washington Group membership in the first session of the day tomorrow on all that you discussed in the discussion room. So basically the key highlights of your discussion, since we all want to hear what's going on in these various regions. So just remember, it's going to be important for you to pick someone for that role up front and make sure that they are coming tomorrow for that first session of the day. After you assign your rapporteur, you can begin your discussions. And we have prepared a list of discussions, which I'm going to show in a second. You'll also be able to find them in the meeting agenda. And I do want to note before I move to those discussion questions that there will not be a formal closing today, so you can remain in your breakout room for as long as you would like. Next slide, please. Okay, so these are the discussion questions. Please note they are optional. If your regional group would like to talk about other topics, such as if there's a work plan you need to discuss, or you want to discuss other activities coming up in the region, by all means, please do that. But if not, these questions can guide your discussion. Please take a photo of these questions or have your meeting agenda up on screen for yourself, since when we go into the breakout rooms, you will not see this slide anymore. Okay, at this point, I would like to officially open the breakout rooms. Brianna, could you please launch those breakout rooms for us? Great. So you should all see a pop-up appear on screen, and you can go ahead and join a room. All right, I'll let everyone take it away. And again, we're not formally closing today. Feel free to stay in those rooms as long as you would like, and we will see you tomorrow.
Good afternoon, everyone. Are we already? The meeting is being recorded. Good afternoon.
Yeah.